So in our seminar, one of our conclusions was that in many cases, these interstate wars are just going to happen and burn out. Nobody's going to do anything, and eventually you're left with a mess. And then the question is, how do you clean up the mess and re-glue the society together? And as we read the literature on post-conflict measures, it occurred to us that these harder measures that David was emphasizing yesterday, juridical, retributive, courts, punishments, they can't be the whole picture in many cases. Sometimes they're hard to implement, and even when you can implement them, they're not enough. You need the so-called softer methods, and very important. And the military community doesn't talk enough about these. I don't think is aware of them to the requisite degree. So we wanted to have at least an hour talking about that, and we have the best speaker in the United States to talk about these issues, Daniel Philpott, professor of political science at University of Notre Dame. And he has written the best book, I think, on this topic called Just and Unjust Peace, An Ethic of Reconciliation. So, over to you.
Thank you, Ed. I'm very honored to be invited to this conference. In a talk on reconciliation and dealing with wounds and resentments, I wanted to clear up any remaining resentments regarding my own home affiliation and congratulate Navy on their 2007 victory after 40 years of losses over Notre Dame. But also just to remind you that it doesn't always last, and there's 2015. So it continues on. On a more serious level, since the end of the Cold War, the United States and other Western states have encountered their thorniest foreign policy difficulties in their efforts to establish peace in societies sundered by conflict. The problem has proved far more difficult than military victory itself. The Clinton administration's worst foreign policy disaster in Somalia, where one recalls the Black Hawk Down disaster, came not in securing the delivery of relief supplies, but in seeking to build state institutions afterwards. The knottiest dilemmas of President George W. Bush arose in trying to secure order after formal military victories in Iraq and Afghanistan. President Barack Obama's participation in NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011 was, fairly easily overthrew Gaddafi, but left behind a civil war that is yet to be settled. Are the problems of peace building ones for which ethics can provide guidance? Ethicists have offered far more analysis regarding the justice of undertaking wars in Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and Afghanistan than they have in regarding the aftermath of these conflicts. When it came to going to war, they had at their disposal the centuries-old just war tradition. But this tradition has much less to say about the dilemmas faced when the formal part of a war is over, yet a just and stable peace is still distant. It is true that a few scholars have thought about a jus post bellum to supplement the traditional jus ad bellum and jus in bello criteria of the just war framework. Most of these conceive the question in terms of the obligations of an intervening power to secure peace before departure. And while this is a critical question indeed, it takes a narrow view of what a just peace consists of, not only for outsiders, but also for the inhabitants of a country that has lived through war or dictatorship. May perpetrators of crimes receive amnesty? What about mere combatants? Or does justice require trials and punishment? If so, again, for whom? Should members of an unjust regime be debarred from holding office? Which ones? Can apologies and forgiveness be appropriate political practices? If so, who should practice them? Under what circumstances? What is the most just way to acknowledge and remember victims and their wounds? Should victims receive reparations? If so, which ones? What about living representatives of the dead? Such questions beg for a development of the tradition, for moral reasoning about a new set of dilemmas. I sought to explore these questions in my book of 2012, Just and Unjust Peace. Today, I outline the broad contours of the ethic of peace building developed there. First, I briefly spell out the dominant global conception, the liberal peace. Then I turn to my ethic, whose unifying concept is reconciliation. It shares the just war tradition's religious and philosophical foundations and incorporates a core proposition of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, two of the just war tradition's pioneers, namely that the purpose of a just war is a just peace. But it confronts the reality that a just peace requires more than going to war and fighting it well, but also an effort to build peace after the war is over. I will then deploy the ethic of reconciliation to Iraq, a site where peace-building dilemmas have been at their most difficult. Reconciliation indeed rose to prominence in the parlance of policymakers and other influential voices in both the U.S. and Iraq during the civil war fought in Iraq beginning in 2006, and at least up until the U.S. withdrew most of its troops from Iraq in 2011. After this withdrawal, ISIS arose, and by summer 2014 had captured a substantial swath of Iraq, taking advantage of weakness in governance that was due in no small part to a lack of reconciliation. Iraq's large Sunni majority was so disaffected at their exclusion from governance by the ruling Shiite majority that many Sunnis sided with a sadistic and ruthless faction rather than their own government. Today, now that ISIS is freshly defeated, at least in Iraq, the problems of communal divisions remain. U.S. military troops, which helped to defeat ISIS, will likely remain too. The U.S. interest in mitigating these divisions is therefore strong. It is not only the U.S. that has faced the problems of peace building. Confronting the dilemmas of past injustices has been the central challenge of tens of societies that have emerged from dictatorship amidst the third wave of democratization over the past generation, or have settled their civil wars since the end of the Cold War. Their efforts have involved international peacekeeping and peace-building forces, truth commissions, election monitoring, trials, reparation schemes, official apologies, dramatic statements of forgiveness, and many other measures. These efforts, and broadly, the U.S. effort to reconstruct Iraq, are usually guided by the moral logic of the liberal peace, the paradigm that predominates in the world's most powerful institutions. The liberal peace can be described through 7 tenets. First, armed conflict must come to a halt through a ceasefire or more enduring settlement. Second, human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and free market economic institutions are to be established. Third, prominent among the actors who build peace in societies that have suffered massive violence and other injustices are international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank, as well as powerful liberal democracies like the United States or Germany. The next 3 tenets, though not always included in descriptions of the liberal peace, prescribe responses to past injustices that resonate with liberalism's philosophical commitments. The fourth is punishment for violators of human rights, trials, imprisonment, sometimes execution, and often vetting procedures that debar past perpetrators from holding certain jobs. Measures justified typically today either through Kantian retributive arguments, consequentialist appeals for the importance of accountability in establishing new regimes based on the rule of law, or a combination of the two. I would argue that this one has a particular pride of place in the contemporary liberal peace, that among international lawyers, human rights activists, and so forth, the dream of trying, the Nuremberg dream of trying individuals who have committed massive human rights violations or war crimes has a kind of paramountcy. The fifth tenet is reparations for victims. Sixth, liberals are wary of the political promotion of personal and spiritual healing, the transformation of emotions, and interpersonal reconciliation, phenomena properly relegated to the private realm, they say. Seventh, included in the liberal peace is a commitment to expressing rationales through secular language. It is because of their promotion of values like rights, democracy, constitutionalism, and certain rationales for punishment that are found in the thought of Locke, Kant, and their philosophical descendants, most notably John Rawls, that these tenets can be collectively called the liberal peace. At least one other paradigm for engaging the aftermath of massive violence and injustice, though, has sprung up across the globe in recent years: reconciliation. It often has been espoused by religious leaders in these debates and has its strongest roots in religious traditions, though is not exclusively religious and has secular analogs that facilitate building consensus. What I have sought to do in my book, Just and Unjust Peace, is to develop reconciliation into an ethic that can be practiced in the realm of politics. How might such an ethic be conceived? Reconciliation is a concept of justice. This is the ethic's central claim. It will seem a strange claim to citizens steeped in the modern liberal tradition, for whom justice is a matter of rights, fairness, economic equality, and punishment rightly meted out. It is indeed the Bible that grounds the claim strongest. The case for it begins with the linguistic observation that in both the Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament, the terms that are translated into the English word justice also frequently translate into the English word righteousness. This gives a clue as to the meaning of justice. This righteousness is comprehensive, involving right relationship between all the members of a community as prescribed by God's covenant. The term reconciliation itself appears 15 times in the New Testament, though hardly at all in the Old Testament, and means either the process of restoration of right relationship or the condition of right relationship that results from this restoration. If right relationship or comprehensive righteousness is the biblical meaning of justice, then it follows that reconciliation can equally connote the restoration of justice or a resulting state of justice. 2nd Isaiah speaks of justice just in this way, as a saving justice, in which God comprehensively restores the people of Israel to righteousness, ultimately through a messianic suffering servant. The biblical concept of reconciliation not only describes justice, but is also a vision of peace. Just as the ethic of reconciliation developed here aims to build peace in political orders. Shalom, the Hebrew word for peace, in fact means something much like comprehensive righteousness, prescribing a vision for the life of the entire Jewish community that involves health and prosperity, economic and political justice, and honesty and moral integrity in relations between persons. Irene, the New Testament word for peace, is the direct translation of shalom into Greek and connotes a similarly holistic condition. The virtue that animates the process of restoring right relationship is mercy. Mercy in the Bible is a far wider, more restorative virtue than mercy in the Enlightenment tradition, which is primarily a release from justly deserved punishment. Such a concept of mercy complements and indeed quite resembles the biblical concept of saving justice. Reconciliation as a concept of justice and of peace and of mercy is manifested not only in the Bible's language, but also in the accounts of God's response to evil. It is a response that differs quite distinctly from the intellectual, quote, solutions to the problem of evil that Enlightenment philosophers proposed. This response to evil is rather one of action, an action that restores the nation of Israel through forgiveness, reinstatement of the rights of the poor, the renewal of creation, and even punishment. In the Jewish scriptures of the Old Testament, these actions make up tikkun olam, the repair of the universe through which God renews his covenant. The Gospels later identify Jesus as the one who fills Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servant who, quote, leads justice to victory. This justice of victory, which here again involves forgiveness, a judgment upon evil, hope for the poor, the renewal of the creation, climaxes here. Importantly, for building a consensus around principles of reconciliation in a context like Iraq, many of these same building blocks can be found in Islam. As they appear in Islamic scriptures and tradition, Arabic words for justice, reconciliation, peace, and mercy are far closer to Jewish and Christian understandings than to those of John Locke or Immanuel Kant. With some interpretive effort, the Quran's words for justice, adl and qist, can be understood to mean comprehensive right relationship. The Arabic sulh means settlement of differences through a restoration of relationship, while musalaha translates directly to reconciliation and carries a connotation of comprehensiveness. Further, salam, the Arabic word for peace, refers to a general state of harmony, not just a cessation of hostility, much like the Jewish shalom. Likewise, the words for mercy, rahmah, rahim, and rahamin, connote a broadly construed compassion, a general will to restore. Whereas the Quran contains no notion of divine atonement, It does portray God as restoring relationship with sinful humans through their repentance and his forgiveness. At least some portions of Islamic criminal law arguably contain a notion of restorative justice. Most powerfully, traditional Arab Muslim rituals of sul and musalaha, employed to restore relationships within villages and communities in the wake of serious crimes, entail richer notions of restoration than virtually any comparable communal rituals that I have found in the Christian or Jewish traditions. My claim is not that the Islamic notions of justice, mercy, and reconciliation are univocal with Christian and Jewish conceptions, but rather that meaningful dialogue and achievement of consensus around the principles of reconciliation that I set forth here can occur both in Muslim context and in context where Muslims and Christians, or Jews in the case, may mingle. If reconciliation as a concept of justice is rooted in ancient theological text, what form might it take in modern politics? Modern political orders, at least ones characterized by human rights, democracy, and limited constitutional government, will promote less than the whole range of relationships involved in tzedek and shalom. They attend primarily to those relationships between citizens embodied in public law. And in this sense, I'm certainly an advocate of limited government. But if political reconciliation promotes less than tzedek and shalom, it involves much more than mere restoration of rights and institutions. It also involves a wide range of measures aimed at restoring the wide range of wounds that political justices inflict. Just what are these wounds? The definition of political injustice arises from contemporary transitions themselves. They are violations of the human rights and the laws of war that are spelled out in international conventions. But if these norms define political injustices, they do not describe the multiform and textured ways in which they, wound their victims. There are at least 6. First, the violation of the victim's basic human rights. The first form of woundedness indeed resembles the very definition of a political injustice. But since the legal guarantee of a person's human rights is a key aspect of what he is entitled to vis-a-vis the community of citizens in that state, this violation is one of the forms of woundedness that arises from a political injustice. Second are the many forms of harms to the victim's person. Among these are death, the death of loved ones, permanent bodily injury, grief, humiliation, trauma, the loss of wealth and livelihood, the defilement of one's race, ethnicity, religion, nationality, or gender, sexual violation, and many other harms. Third is victims' ignorance of the source and circumstances of the political injustices that harm them. Often simply not to know what happened can be a form of woundedness. Fourth is the failure of members of the community to acknowledge victim suffering, either through ignorance or indifference. Fifth is the standing victory of the perpetrator's political injustice. It is not only harms to the victim's person that political injustices leave behind, but also an unchallenged, undefeated message of disregard for the victim's dignity, a message that constitutes an additional harm to the victim and the shared values of the community. Sixth, the wounded soul of the perpetrator. Deep in several religious and philosophical traditions is the idea that evil injures the soul of the perpetrator. Often this injury will redound in severe psychological damage and can contribute to further woundedness and injustices. Because these 6 forms of wounds are inflicted directly by political injustices, they may be called primary wounds. But they also result in secondary wounds, acts of further injustice and withdrawals of assent from new regimes that arise from the emotions of fear, hatred, resentment, and revenge that emanate from memories of the original injustices themselves. As the experience of countries like Bosnia, Ireland, and Rwanda attest, these secondary wounds further stunt the project of building just and stable political orders, sometimes for generations. Correspondingly, an ethic of political reconciliation aspires to heal and restore persons and relationships with respect to the range of primary and secondary wounds that political injustices inflict. reflecting the sense in which religious traditions view reconciliation as action every bit as much as they view it as principle. It is through practices that the ethic is realized, indeed through 6 multiple and interdependent practices. They are building institutions for social justice, acknowledgement, reparations, punishment, apology, and forgiveness. Each manifests reconciliation's core logic of restoration of right relationship and restores a distinct dimension of woundedness. Inasmuch as these practices heal primary wounds, they affect what can be called primary restorations. These restorations can then affect secondary restorations, certain forms of social capital, including an increase in popular trust in the political order, democratic participation, and identification with the nation. It is important to remember that in the political realm, as the experience of the past generation has shown, these restorative practices will always be achieved only in part, always hampered by power and unresolved differences over the meaning of justice, and limited by their sheer size and complexity. But as the past generation has also shown, the practices are not merely the brainchild of armchair theorists. Each of the 6 has in fact taken place in numerous settings over the past generation, however messily, and might now contribute something to the building of peace in Iraq. It is just this predicament that calls for an ethic, one that would be irrelevant if the practices never occurred, and that would be unnecessary if they occurred without difficulty. But it's not all talk of reconciliation, especially in a place like Iraq, naive and utopian, especially a concept of reconciliation whose endpoint is shalom or salam. Admittedly, it is rather a Hobbesian peace that U.S. policymakers prioritized following the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, an end to levels of political violence that they neither anticipated nor planned for when they first went to war, and a securing of a degree of order that would allow them to withdraw troops, as they finally did in 2011. Today, the concern is to prevent the resurgence of ISIS or a group like it. Yet, is it not also true that the very sources of violence are just the sort that reconciliation addresses? A 2003 New York Times story tells of a Shiite Iraqi, Sadri Adab Diwan, whose younger sister Hama was abducted and killed by Saddam's regime in 1980 for giving a Quran to a classmate. "If I catch Saddam," Diwan promised, "I won't kill him. That won't be enough. I'll suck his blood, and if he escapes, I'll follow him to the ends of the earth," unquote. Such pursuits of revenge on the part of Shiites as well as Kurds, both of whom were subordinated by Sunni since the beginning of the Ba'athist regime and brutally suppressed by Saddam, were common since after Saddam's fall and redoubled with subsequent attacks and killings. Sunnis responded in kind. After the February 2006 destruction of the Shiite Golden Mosque of Samarra and the wave of retaliation that it sparked, a full-fledged civil war ensued. It was a conflict between partisans with national, religious, and ethnic identities, driven by communal loyalties, fear of the other's domination, and the emotions of revenge and hatred that memories of past injustices had generated. After the civil war died down, the same loyalties, fear, and emotions led Shiites to exclude Sunnis from power and helped to create the power vacuum that led to ISIS. Now, the moderation and assuage of these sentiments are indispensable to any achievement of stability in Iraq. During the period of the Civil War, reconciliation indeed rose to become arguably the most frequent and most salient principle to which policymakers, US and European, but also Iraqi, made reference in their proposed solutions. The Iraq Study Group report of November 2006, a landmark set of commissions by a bipartisan commission appointed by the US government, mentioned reconciliation 63 times and devoted a major section to it. The term showed up frequently in the benchmarks that Congress set for US policy and that the US government set for the Iraqis, and was proffered vigorously in the speeches of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, US Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, and his successor, Ryan Crocker, and other voices in the US government, like that of Congressman Chris Smith. UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi, and heads of state like Tony Blair and Silvio Berlusconi also urged it. Iraqis themselves took up the concept as well, not least Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who in June 2006 unveiled a 28-point comprehensive plan for reconciliation, one said to be inspired by South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that received wide support from several parties in the Iraqi government as well as Turkey. Conferences of Iraqi civil society, including religious leaders, have advanced reconciliation too. Perhaps most importantly, reconciliation was a central and explicit goal of General David Petraeus, who led the surge that did much to bring the open civil war to a close. When political officials spoke of reconciliation, what did they mean? Usually some combination of the following: a greater incorporation of Sunnis into the government, a reversal of draconian de-Baathification policies, a sharing of oil revenue among Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds, provincial elections to boost local autonomy, a wide amnesty for both members of Saddam's security forces and more recent insurgents, and greater autonomy for Kurds. But is this vision enough to bring peace and stability to Iraq, America's central foreign policy goal? Can the goals of political reconciliation as conceived here themselves be achieved apart from a broader array of measures conducted by a broader array of actors with a broader array of goals, including a significant transformation of the memories, emotions, and desire for revenge that brought about the civil war and contributed to the rise of ISIS? Top negotiator of the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and Palestine, Dennis Ross, made much the same point in a speech 6 years later when he attributed the subsequent breakdown of the settlement to its failure to take hold in the attitudes of the population. The same insight also lies behind the truth commissions that over 40 countries have undertaken in the wake of dictatorship and civil war in the past generation. Arguably, at least some of these succeeded in bringing stability and a measure of legitimacy to new governments and settlements. I would argue that on balance, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission did much to prevent civil war following apartheid. In a recent article in Foreign Affairs, scholar Phil Clark argued that Rwanda's Gacaca courts have done much to assuage the wounds that could beget another genocide there. Similarly, a stable Iraq requires stable institutions, which in turn require legitimacy in the eyes of the population, which in turn requires dealing with the wounds that give rise to the desire to withhold such legitimacy. Providing the moral framework for the job that is required is an ethic of reconciliation grounded in biblical and Quranic conceptions of justice, mercy, and peace, and enacted through a set of 6 practices that transform the wounds of injustice. The first practice, building socially just institutions, is the one that corresponds most with current U.S. policy in Iraq and with ideals of global institutions, the liberal peace. It includes the rule of law based on a constitution that promotes democracy and human rights and a commitment to economic development. The wounds that it heals are the lack of recognition of the rights and dignity of the person and the Iraqi citizens that existed under the regime of Saddam. Today, human rights are guaranteed in law, but often not in practice. I would particularly emphasize here the importance of religious freedom and of incorporating religious minorities who were driven out of the country, like Christians, Yazidis, and Mandeans. A recent report by at the Center for American Progress just came out the other day, makes this case strongly with respect to reconciliation in Iraq. However, more is required. Acknowledgement is the practice of conferring recognition upon the sufferings of victims of human rights violations. It seeks to overcome the community's ignorance of this suffering, and sometimes even the victim's own ignorance of the circumstances in which the violation took place. Accounts of transitional justice from around the world show that victims are often willing to forego revenge and give their assent to a new political regime, a secondary restoration, once they have received recognition for their suffering. Discovering and exposing the injustices of the past creates legitimacy for the regime of the future. In recent transitions away from war and dictatorship, states have practiced acknowledgement through a form of institution that is new in the past generation, the Truth Commission, an official body charged with investigating and producing a public record of past injustices. Truth Commissions practice acknowledgement best
when the recognition they confer is most personal, occurring through public hearings or other opportunities for witness testimony. Respected voices in the international community have indeed put forth proposals for an Iraqi Truth Commission. Acknowledgement can also be practiced effectively and all the more personally through community-level forums. A remarkable survey of Iraqis conducted by the International Center for Transitional Justice and the Human Rights Center of the University of California, Berkeley, showed broad popular support for truth-seeking processes, especially local forums and ones conducted by non-governmental organizations. Acknowledgement might also take place through documentation centers, the unearthing of mass graves, museums, and memorials, for which the same report shows strong support, and which the leaders like the prominent Iraqi exile, Kanan Makia, has vigorously promoted. The logic behind the third practice, reparations, is much like the argument for acknowledgement. It is a form of recognition that the state or even the perpetrator himself confers on victims. Their difference is that they are material, taking the form of money, mental and health services, access to education, employment, and the like. The wound that they address is in part lack of recognition for the victim, but also the victim's material loss, economic, physical, and psychological. Understood, to be sure, no amount of reparations could reverse the loss of a loved one or a permanent injury. But often, reparations can both compensate in part for the material dimension of the loss and symbolically communicate recognition to the victim. Like acknowledgement, reparations might help to reduce victims' resentment and elicit their assent for a new regime. Among the respondents in the Iraqi Voices report, support was widespread for material and symbolic compensation. Former Deputy Secretary of State Stuart E. Eisenstadt proposed that a compensation fund, overseen by both Iraqi and international representatives, be established for victims of torture, assassination, or other human rights abuses. European foundations for victims of Nazi injustices can serve as a model. Eisenstadt also proposed a property commission to resolve the claims, often complex and conflicting, of the tens of thousands of Iraqis who were displaced from their homes under Saddam's rule. The fourth practice, punishment, might seem at first like a strange one in an ethic of reconciliation. In settings of transitional justice all over the world, reconciliation is pitted against punishment, restorative justice against retributive justice, and forgiveness against imprisonment and accountability. Punishment, though, need not be at odds with reconciliation, but only if it is justified differently than through the logics of retributivism and consequentialism, between which Western arguments about criminal justice have oscillated for the last couple of centuries. It is rather what theologian Christopher B. Marshall calls restorative justice, grounded in biblical text, that can contribute to reconciliation. There are strong foundations for restorative punishment in the Quran and in Arab tribal practices as well. Addressing the wounds of the standing victory of the human rights violators' message of injustices and the disorder in the wrong of the soul of the wrongdoer himself, restorative punishment seeks to repair persons, relationships, and political orders in the wake of massive political injustices. Restorative justice may involve long-term imprisonment for the top masterminds of human rights violations and prison for politically motivated acts of murder, rape, torture, and assault. Lower-level perpetrators might receive amnesty, but amnesty that is conditional on participation in public forums like truth commissions and other public rituals that perform other dimensions of the restoration of wounds. Even those who have committed the most serious crimes might face such a public forum in addition to trials and imprisonment. It is hard to imagine a less restorative form of punishment than the public hanging of Saddam Hussein, which flamed tensions between Sunnis and Shiites not only in Iraq, but throughout the Arab world. Restorative punishment also implies a version of vetting that involves far more careful scrutiny of past complicity with Saddam's crimes than the Bush administration's sweeping de-Baathification. The fifth practice, apology, has become far more common in global politics in the past generation. Through a public apology, an individual perpetrator or head of state or other leader can nullify his or her group's ongoing commitment to its injustices, delegitimize the political injustice of the previous regime or faction in a war, and contribute to the legitimacy of a new regime. Apologies by former Ba'athist leaders or by today's heads of Sunni and Shiite armies and factions for their members' acts of terrorism, for instance, might go a long way towards diffusing tensions. Forgiveness is the most distinctly theological of the 6 practices and the most rarely practiced in the political realm. In Christianity, forgiveness is an imitation and participation in God's redemptive act on the cross. Theologians are divided over whether victims ought to initiate it or perform it as a response to a prior apology. In Islam, God forgives the repentant sinner and commands the victim to forgive a wrongdoer who apologizes, as the Quran stresses over and over. When practiced towards political injustices, forgiveness might strengthen the agency of victims, defeat the wrongdoer's message of injustice by condemning and then overcoming it, diffuse cycles of revenge, and greatly facilitate the building of a new political order. In the context of transitional justice, forgiveness has occurred most commonly in the context of truth commissions or other forums where the acknowledgement of victim suffering and the apology of perpetrators has first occurred. Iraqi Voices show significant support for forgiveness among ordinary Iraqis, though far less when it is seen as an amnesty that would replace the punishment of top perpetrators. Indeed, it would not be. If punishment is justified restoratively, then forgiveness can complement justified judicial prosecution and punishment as a common restorative practice. Again, the 6 practices all manifest the restorative logic of an ethic of political reconciliation. In Iraq, this ethic implies a far wider set of activities than what policymakers now mean by political reconciliation, but activities that may well be vital to the success of political reconciliation. Skeptics will ask, is not such a vision too burdensome for the U.S. military? Presidents are reluctant even to place military advisors in Iraq, much less commission ambitious reconciliation programs. I recall the response of a Notre Dame ROTC officer to a student who asked him why the military doesn't get to the root of conflicts. "We don't do roots," he responded. Reconciliation success, in fact, depends on these activities being conducted by a far wider array of actors than the U.S. military alone. The U.S. Armed Forces themselves recognized this conclusion insofar as they sought to construct provincial reconstruction teams, concerned local citizens programs, and bottom-up reconciliation programs that coordinate U.S. efforts with those of local Iraqi citizens. This was in the earlier period, before 2011. What is needed, though, and what the U.S. would do well to recognize and promote, is a much broader incorporation of both international institutions and civil society actors in reconciliation and reconstruction efforts. The UN and the legitimacy that it confers can bolster the work of a truth commission or a reparations board. The International Criminal Court would provide a far better mode for trying and punishing top Iraqi war criminals than Iraqi national courts, helping to alleviate the divisive perception of victors' justice. NGOs, especially ones that focus on transitional justice, could provide both expertise and objectivity. A too often overlooked asset, especially by a still too secularized U.S. foreign policy establishment, is religious leaders. Prestigious voices in a religious society like Iraq, they are potential carriers and promoters of an ethic of reconciliation. The Iraq Study Group, hardly outside the policy mainstream, drew just this conclusion in its report. Religious leaders have already gathered in a handful of major conferences designed to bring together divided factions. Dramatic here is the work of Anglican canon Andrew White, who created an Iraqi interreligious initiative that brings together high-level Shiite and Sunni leaders, as well as representatives of minority groups, including Iraqi Christians. The support of a united front of religious leaders for the practices of reconciliation that I have outlined would crucially enable their occurrence and their success. To envision such an array of actors conducting the portfolio of practices that make up an ethic of reconciliation is not to invoke easy optimism, but to offer an approach that can improve the prospects of a most difficult dilemma. Not an alternative to U.S. military efforts, this approach is rather a broader framework for peace building that includes these efforts, but situates them in partnership with other players and stratagems. Broadest of all, it is an alternative conception of justice, one whose roots lie in the text of the Abrahamic religious traditions. But it is a conception with concrete operational implications, ones that might well contribute to stability in Iraq, which would benefit both Iraqis and the U.S. Therein lies the realism of reconciliation. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that. I found it very persuasive, and I think that's great. I just had a question about forgiveness, the last element. I had wondered if you'd considered some of the feminist critiques of the use of political forgiveness, so Maisha Cherry and Alice McLaughlin, who say that like forgiveness puts this burden on usually the victims, the oppressed minorities, women, etc. There's pressure to do it. So it ends up having this sort of doubly negative effect of not actually being forgiveness and then actually harming the perpetrator, the victim. Sorry.
Yes. No, those are excellent considerations. I have thought about some of those critiques. My essential response is I think that can be the case, and so I think it does have to be taken very seriously. Sometimes forgiveness can be a kind of placing the burden back on the victim. There can be environments in which people feel pressure to forgive. Sometimes forgiveness can be seen as a substitute for the whole other range of measures. Interestingly, all of the other practices are ones that do something for the victim, whereas forgiveness is something that the victim performs, right? So one could see that this is sort of telling the victim, forgo all these things that are really due to you, and forgive instead. And so it could be a kind of disempowering thing like that. But at the same time, I think that it doesn't have to be. One thing I think is that it has to do with how I understand forgiveness, namely that it's not just a relinquishment of resentment or claims or what have you, but it's also a constructive act by which a victim constructs something in the world and better right relationship. And in that case, I think it can be actually empowering of agency. So in some of my work in Uganda, in that case, I think it's interesting because it was a woman, but a remarkable woman whose daughter had been abducted, but decided to practice forgiveness and then advocate it with others. But she was somebody who was she was strong and agentic, in doing so. It wasn't the kind of disempowered person. I also think that forgiveness should be practiced, in conjunction with other, practices as well. I think that can help it from being this kind of, disempowering thing. Also, the kind of, circumstances and institutions, echoing Alan Buchanan's argument about where it's practiced. I think respect for the freedom of somebody to forgive, even in terms of social pressure, to forgive or not to forgive is very important. I think sometimes it's when there can be strong pressure that it can be disempowering, and especially to women. One interesting also thing that there is a kind of feminist critique of forgiveness, but there are also other feminists who argue that forgiveness is something that is sort of uniquely feminine, kind of like the care feminist or the Carol Gilligan in a different voice style feminist. So there is also another kind of dynamic there that I think is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Really fascinating. I just wanted to invite you to reflect on whether this model can be applicable or might be applicable also to individual cases of criminality, rights abuses and so forth in civil society. To what extent can we take this model outside of the purely political domain?
Yes, so I think there have been societies like, this comes to mind, Western democracies like the US and Canada, New Zealand, Australia, where they have sought to institute what they call restorative justice on the local level. And it's been tried mostly with respect to juvenile crimes in the juvenile process. But so what happens is on one model, instead of the judge gives a determination, but instead of a sentence, he sends them to a panel. So then the victim and the perpetrator, usually family members, significant others from the community are there. So they enter into a kind of dialogue where they address all the harms that were done, not only so that the wrongdoer understands the impact of the deeds, but also that the victim is heard as well. That's one of the problems with kind of standard judicial criminal trials. Often victims don't get acknowledgement, and oftentimes they can work out something together, like what would be the right punishment. I was once a mediator on one of these panels, and you had a teenage vandal who had destroyed equipment in a store. Well, the store owner agreed eventually that he could come work there for the amount of hours that would restore the economic value of what was lost. But then in the process, he would learn good work habits and things like that. So that's, on the level of juvenile crime, it's not, this hasn't been applied to rapes and murder and so forth. But at least it's a kind of, there are some efforts to sort of establish this in, civil society and within kind of stable institutions. Non-political crimes.
I have a question. So you've done work in Kashmir and Africa, a couple places, and wanted to invite you to just talk about how that works. So these are Westerners going into non-Western societies, histories of colonialism. So how do you do that work? And related to that, what works best to agents that work with the U.S. government or NGOs? And if NGOs, secular versus religious, and maybe there's interaction between the government and these NGOs. So what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did some work in Kashmir for 6 years under an NGO based in Washington called the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. And that center is one that's dedicated to faith-based reconciliation, but to doing it with, all faiths. So I think the faith-based part actually helped to give credibility, but I think the fact that it was all faiths was also helpful as well. It wasn't seen as much as a kind of Christian Western kind of thing coming in from the outside. The work that I did there involved civil society meetings where people from different realms of civil society, people who had been involved in the conflict in different ways would come, maybe say 80 people in a room for 3.5 days. And one of the first things to be done is just getting people to hear the other side. And that was, so it's something that's might seem very simple or very obvious, but when tensions are at such a level, just getting people to be able to hear the other side without interrupting or putting a spin on it or saying, but, and, and if that can be done successfully, it's a huge step. But then we, the second part is we look at wounds of injustice. Before we get to forgiveness or what should be done or reparations or accountability or anything, just to get the wounds of the injustice on the table and have people tell stories about what the conflict did to them. And then it proceeds to kind of getting into things like accountability and reparations and forgiveness as well. And so, there are cases. I think the seminars were reasonably effective in, at the very least, getting people to sit in a room with other people whom they wouldn't have otherwise. But also to, in some cases, there were examples of apology and forgiveness, or people who stood up and were able to say words of healing towards the other side that they wouldn't have beforehand. And I think the chief limitation of this kind of work is that it stays on civil society. Civil society work, it helps to build a kind of cadre or network of people committed to this, but I think it's all, other models are maybe more effective in kind of bringing together, leaders and people from different levels, connecting them together. So.
Well, we're right at time.
Okay.
We can end there. And I just want to recommend to everybody to take a look at Dan's book. He sketched it. It's here today, but it's extremely rich. Many great case studies. It's secular, philosophical, and religious. It's just a wonderful piece of work, so I highly recommend it. And thank you for coming and sharing your ideas from it with us. And the official hat, USS Stockdale hat. Possibly not to be taken on these reconciliation missions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.